My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 63 years old, and for 41 years I was the only locksmith in Ohio City, that half of Cleveland trusted with the keys to everything they owned. Before you keep listening, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, what time is it right now where you are? Because for me, that night, the clock never stopped mattering. At 2:13 in the morning, my phone lit up the dark of my bedroom. A text from my son. Marcus works financial crimes for the FBI Cleveland field office, and my son does not send messages at 2:13 in the morning unless the world is already tilting. Dad, don't open the door. Lock everything. Get to the workshop and stay there. Do not tell Derek I texted you. I read it twice, my heart hammering against my ribs like it hadn't in years. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone into the darkness. Derek, my son-in-law. Asleep 2 doors down the hall with my daughter, or so I believed. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. I spent 4 decades studying locks the way other men scripture. I could read a deadbolt the way a doctor reads an x-ray. I knew in my bones, in my hands, exactly what it meant when a lock gave way too easily, and what it meant when it didn't give way at all. That night, I was about to learn that the most dangerous lock in my house wasn't on any door. It was buried 3 years deep in my own family, and I hadn't seen it turning. I grew up in a house 2 streets over from the one I still live in, on a block of brick 2 flats and maple trees in Ohio City, the kind of neighborhood where everybody's father fixed something for a living. Mine ran a hardware counter. I apprenticed under a locksmith named Gustav Reiner, starting at 17. Learned to read a wafer tumbler blind, learned to cut a key by feel before I ever touched a machine that could do it for me. By 25, I had my own shop, Whitfield Lock and Key, on Fulton Road, hand-painted sign, bell over the door. I married Eleanor Doyle the same year I opened it. She used to say I loved locks more than I loved people, and I used to tell her that wasn't true. It was just that locks never lied to you. People, she'd remind me with that half-smile of hers, weren't locks. She was righter than either of us knew. We raised 2 children in that house on Bridge Avenue. Claire, my daughter, and Marcus, my son. Claire is 44 now, works as a boutique manager, always had Eleanor's warmth and my stubbornness in equal parts. Marcus is 41, joined the bureau 12 years ago after 6 years as a beat cop, works financial crimes, the kind of quiet, careful man who reads a room before he ever opens his mouth in it. Eleanor died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end. I closed the shop the week she went into hospice and never reopened it, though I never sold the building either. Some things you can't let go of even when they stop making sense. I kept my workshop at home instead, a converted attached garage where I restored antique locks and cut ceremonial keys for the Historical Society downtown. More hobby than income by then, but it kept my hands from forgetting what they knew. The hardest thing Eleanor left behind wasn't the house, or the furniture, or the 40 years of photographs. It was a small cedar box on our bedroom dresser that held exactly one item. A brass skeleton key, 8 inches long, engraved along the bow with her initials, EMD, Eleanor Marie Doyle, the letters worn soft from her thumb. It had belonged to her grandmother's farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, a house that burned down before Eleanor was even born, and the key was the only thing that survived the fire. She kept it not because it opened anything anymore, but because it was proof that some things outlast the flames that try to take them. After she died, I moved that box to my nightstand and I looked at that key every single night before I turned off the lamp. Only 3 people in the world had ever held that key in their hands: Eleanor, myself, and Claire. The day her mother let her hold it once when she was 9 years old and swore her to secrecy about where it was kept. That's the key that opened my front door at 1:47 in the morning, 3 years after my wife had died, in the hands of a man who had no earthly right to be holding it. But I need to walk you back to how I got to that basement window, because the key didn't just appear out of nowhere. Nothing in this story did. Everything that happened had been building, quietly, patiently, for 3 years, and I was too grateful for the company in an empty house to see it happening around me. Derek Voss came into Claire's life about 3.5 years ago, not long after Eleanor's funeral, in fact, which I should have registered as strange and didn't, because grief makes you forgive timing you'd otherwise question. He worked in wealth management, he said, helping retirees and small business owners restructure their assets for what he called generational efficiency. Good-looking man, mid-40s, expensive watch, the kind of handshake that lasted half a second too long, like he was measuring you. Claire lit up around him in a way I hadn't seen since her college years, and a widowed father wants nothing more in this world than to see his daughter happy again. So I told myself the watch was none of my business. They married 2 years ago, small ceremony at a vineyard outside the city, and I walked my daughter down a grass aisle in a suit that used to fit better before grief took 10 pounds off me I never wanted to lose. I gave a toast about locks and keys, about how the right two people fit together the way a well-cut key fits a well-maintained tumbler, no forcing required. Derek clinked his glass and thanked me for, quote, welcoming him into the family's legacy. I remember thinking that was an odd way to phrase it. I didn't think about it again for almost a year. The proposal to move in came last spring, over coffee at my own kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught both my children long division. Dad, Claire said, stirring sugar she didn't need, Derek's between office leases downtown and our apartments coming up for renewal. We were thinking, just for a while, we could move in here, help you out. This house is a lot for one person. I should have told her no. 41 years of reading locks teaches you to notice when something doesn't sit flush, and something about that conversation didn't sit flush. But I was a man alone in a house built for four, eating dinner most nights standing at the counter because the dining table felt too large and too quiet, and my daughter was offering to fill it back up. I said yes before I'd even finished my coffee. That was my first mistake, and I want you to remember it, because everything after grew out of that single moment of a lonely man wanting to believe his daughter still needed him more than she needed what he had. Derek moved in like a man taking inventory. First week, security cameras, 4 of them, wired into an app on his phone. For your safety, Harold, he told me, that easy smile never slipping. A man your age, alone in a big house, you can't be too careful anymore. I noticed, months later, that there wasn't a single camera covering my workshop. Interesting for a man so committed to safety. Second month, it was the finances. Let me consolidate your accounts, Harold. Streamline the bills. I do this professionally. It'll save you real money. I'd been balancing my own books since before Derek Voss was born, but I let him in, because refusing felt like an insult to a man trying to earn his place in my family. Third month, my friends stopped calling as often. When they did call, Derek was always the one who answered my phone from the kitchen counter where I'd left it charging. Harold's resting, he'd say, smooth as a well-oiled hinge. I'll have him call you back. I never did, because I never knew they'd called. My old apprentice from the shop days, a man named Salvatore Ricci who I'd trained 30 years ago, and still had lunch with every other Sunday, told me later he tried for 2 months to reach me and got the same answer every time. He finally stopped trying, assumed I'd lost interest in him, and it broke something in me to learn that, because Sal never once thought to blame Derek. Neither did I, not for a long time. Claire went along with all of it, softly, the way water goes along with a crack in a foundation. Dad, you need to slow down, she'd say whenever I questioned a bill or a form Derek had asked me to sign. You're not as sharp as you used to be about this stuff. Let Derek handle it. Let us help you. Let us help you became the phrase I heard more than any other in my own house. And I want you to understand, that phrase is not kindness when it's said enough times. It's a leash, dressed up as an embrace, and it tightens a little more with every use. My son tried harder than anyone to break through. Marcus called one January evening, wanting to visit that weekend. Derek answered my phone in the living room while I sat 10 feet away in my recliner, fully awake, watching a man lie to my son through a smile I was starting to recognize as a mask. Marcus, hey, Harold's turned in early these days. Doctor's orders, keeping regular hours. I'll tell him you called. A pause. No. Don't worry about coming by. He's fine, just needs his rest. You know how it is with the bureau schedule you keep. Don't want you driving out here after a double shift for nothing. After he hung up, I asked, quiet, careful, why didn't you let me talk to my son? You need your rest, Harold, Derek said, not even looking up from his phone. Marcus works crazy hours. He'd just load you up with bureau stress you don't need at your age. He's my son, I said. Claire, from the kitchen doorway, dish towel in her hands. And you have enough on your plate, Dad. Derek's right. You don't need Marcus's FBI stuff weighing on you, too. That was the night I started keeping a private ledger in my head, the way I used to log every key I ever cut for every customer who ever walked into my shop, a habit I'd never fully broken, cataloging details, dates, patterns. Because 41 years behind a locksmith's counter teaches you to notice a pattern before you can name what it means. And none of what was happening in my own home fit the shape of a family taking care of an aging father. It fit the shape of something else. I just didn't have the word for it yet. I played along anyway, acted the grateful old man, the doddering father glad for company, because a man who spent his whole working life reading the moment before someone tried a lock they had no business trying learns patience above every other virtue. You don't force a jammed tumbler. You work it slow, feel for where it catches, and you wait for the moment it wants to give. That moment came on a Tuesday in late September. 11 o'clock at night, house dark except for the hall light Derek insisted stay on for safety, and my phone buzzed against the nightstand where I'd set it beside Eleanor's cedar box. Patrick, no, forgive me, Marcus's name lighting the screen. 2:13 a.m. I'll tell you now for the record, because I checked the clock the second the text came through, the way I've checked clocks and locks my whole life, needing to know exactly when something started. Dad, don't open the door. Lock everything. Get to the workshop and stay there. Do not tell Derek I texted you. I sat up in bed so fast my back seized. My hands shook reading it a second time, a third. Marcus does not send messages like that. Marcus sends call me when you can and happy birthday, Dad, and twice a year, miss you. Thinking about Mom today. He does not send 4 sentences at 2:13 in the morning that sound like a man clearing a building. I did what he said without a single question, because after months of being managed, handled, spoken over and around in my own house, my son's voice, even in text, even without explanation, was the first thing in a long time that felt entirely true. I moved through the dark house barefoot, the way I used to move through it when the kids were small and I didn't want to wake them, every floorboard memorized under my feet. Front door, deadbolt thrown. Back door, same. Kitchen window latch, checked twice. I killed the lights room by room until the house sat in total darkness, and I went down the half flight to my workshop, the converted garage that Derek's cameras somehow never covered, and I eased the door shut behind me without a click. My workbench sat along the far wall, tools hung on pegboard in the exact silhouettes. Eleanor used to tease me for tracing in permanent markers so nothing would ever go back in the wrong spot. Along the shelves above it, my collection, 31 antique locks and mechanisms I'd restored over the years, padlocks from the 1800s, a ship's chest lock from a Great Lakes freighter, a Brahma lock I'd spent 4 years chasing down at estate sales because it was the closest thing to unpickable ever built by hand. I sat in my work chair in the pitch dark, surrounded by decades of things I'd fixed, and I watched the narrow ground-level window that looked out on my own front walk. The house above me was silent. Too silent. I couldn't hear Derek or Claire's bedroom door. Couldn't tell if they were asleep or lying awake listening the same way I was. The minutes crawled past on my watch, 2:30, 2:45, 3, and nothing moved outside except the wind pushing dead leaves across the driveway. At 3:12, I heard footsteps directly above my head. Derek's voice low muffled through the floor joists on a phone call. Yeah, he's down for the night, house is quiet. Give it 30-40 minutes. Park down on bridge, lights off. Come around through the side gate. Not the front. My blood went cold in a way I can only describe as physical, a temperature drop I felt in my teeth. I pressed myself into the darkest corner of the workshop, where the window's angle couldn't catch me, and I made myself breathe slow, the way I used to breathe when picking a stuck tumbler that could snap if you rushed it. I thought, in that moment of Claire at 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on this same workshop floor, while I taught her to feel the pins in a practice lock, with a bent paperclip, patient as I could manage, telling her every lock has a story if you're willing to listen to it instead of forcing it. She'd stay down here for hours some Saturdays, handing me screws, asking why brass tarnished and steel didn't, falling asleep once on the old couch against the wall while I worked, and I carried her upstairs to bed the way you carry something that trusts you completely. That girl felt 1,000 miles from the woman asleep, or not asleep, 2 floors above me while strangers drove toward my house with the lights off. At 3:47, headlights swept low and dim across the ceiling of the driveway, off almost before they'd registered, a car easing to the curb the way a boat eases into a slip when the captain doesn't want to wake anyone on shore. A second car pulled in behind it a minute later, same careful, lightless approach. 2 men got out of the first car, one out of the second. Dark clothing, nothing distinctive, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. Derek opened my front door before any of them so much as touched the bell, and that is when I saw it, the object in the lead man's hand, catching just enough moonlight through my narrow window that I recognized the shape before I recognized what it meant. 8 inches of brass, a worn bow. Even from 30 feet and through old glass, I knew that key the way I knew my own hands, because it had sat in a cedar box on my nightstand every single night for 3 years, and I had looked at it, I swear to you, not 4 hours earlier before I turned off my lamp. The man didn't hand it to Derek. He used it, turned it smoothly in a lock. It had never in its history been cut to fit, because that key had never opened a single functioning door in my entire lifetime with it. It was ornamental. It was Eleanor. It was the last surviving piece of a house that burned to the ground before she was born. And someone had made it work my front door. I understood, sitting frozen in the dark among 31 locks I'd spent my life learning to master, that whoever had built this, had it copied, had it fitted, had it turned into an instrument instead of a memory, had reached into the most private, most sacred thing I owned and repurposed my dead wife's love into a burglar's tool. I did not yet know how. I did not yet know who beyond the men standing at my door. But I knew with a certainty that settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water that this was not a random crime. Someone in my own house had handed them the key to it. I did not move from that corner until the eastern sky over the neighbor's roofline started turning from black to the color of weak tea. 3 hours later, watching my own front door swallow strangers who had walked in like they owned the place, and watching it, an hour later, spit them back out again, carrying a leather folio I did not recognize and had never packed. I counted 200 heartbeats after the second car's taillights disappeared down Bridge Avenue before I let myself breathe normally. And by then, I had already decided one thing with total clarity. The way you decide something only once in a lifetime and never doubt it again. I was done being a man who got helped. I was going to find out exactly what had been done to me and to my wife's memory and to my own front door, and I was going to do it the way I'd spent 41 years doing everything else. Patiently, precisely, and without ever once letting the people who'd broken in know that the lock they thought they'd beaten was quietly, carefully learning every single one of their patterns in return. I climbed those basement stairs at dawn like a man 20 years younger than the one who'd gone down them the night before. Fear does strange things to a body. So does purpose. I found I had more of the second than the first now. The kitchen smelled like coffee when I came up. Derek's doing, always the early riser now, always the first face I saw in the morning, checking on me the way you'd check a smoke detector battery. "Morning, Harold," he said, not turning from the stove. "Sleep all right?" "Like a stone," I said, and reached for a mug, and my hand was steady enough that he never looked twice. Claire came down a few minutes later in her robe, kissed my cheek the way she'd done every morning since she was small enough to need a step stool to reach it. "You're up early, Dad. Couldn't sleep past 6 anymore. Old habit from the shop days. A lie, but a small one. Easy to carry." I ate half a piece of toast I had no appetite for and watched them the way I used to watch a lock cylinder under a loop, magnified, patient, looking for the hairline flaw that told you everything. Derek's eyes flicked to Claire every time he spoke, checking, calibrating. Claire's hand found his forearm twice during breakfast, a small, silent signal passing between them, like Morse code I was only now learning to read. They weren't a father's daughter and her husband anymore, not in that kitchen. They were a unit, a team. And a team like that doesn't form by accident. It forms around a shared purpose, and I intended to find out exactly what that purpose was. The moment Derek's car cleared the corner of Bridge Avenue for his morning meetings, I was moving. Claire was in the shower. I could hear the pipes groan 2 floors up, giving me maybe 12 minutes. And 12 minutes is a lifetime to a man who once cut a working key from a wax impression in under 90 seconds for a customer who'd locked himself out in a snowstorm. I went first to my own nightstand, though I already knew what I'd find. The cedar box sat exactly where it always sat. I opened it with fingers that weren't quite steady, empty, not stolen-looking, not ransacked, emptied carefully. The little velvet lining smoothed back down like whoever took the key had wanted me to believe it was still there if I only glanced, not looked. That told me something important. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was patient, practiced. Someone had studied my habits the way I'd once studied a stubborn tumbler, waiting for the exact right moment when I wouldn't check. Next, I went to my workshop. On the wall behind my workbench, half hidden by a pegboard of chisels, hung something almost nobody in my family had ever paid attention to, my old logbook, 4 decades of green ledger pages, every key I'd ever cut for every customer of Whitfield Lock and Key, address, date, lock make, and model, all of it. I'd kept cutting entries in it, even after I closed the shop, out of habit, a locksmith's version of a diary. Most people who walked through my house saw a dusty old book on a dusty old shelf and looked right past it. Derek had not looked past it. I found it 3 inches out of its usual spot, dust disturbed in a rectangle around where it normally sat, like it had been lifted, examined, and set back down by someone who didn't understand that I would notice a 3-inch shift the way another man would notice a missing car. I flipped through it with my heart in my throat. Pages were intact, nothing torn out, but a folded scrap of paper fluttered from between the pages for my old high-value clients. The doctors and small business owners and one particular gated community out toward Rocky River, where I'd installed specialty safes in the 90s. Someone had photographed pages of that ledger with a phone. I was almost certain, though there was no way to prove it standing there, with my heart going like a trip hammer. But why would anyone want a 30-year-old list of who used to trust Harold Whitfield with their locks? I didn't have the full answer yet. I only had the shape of a question, and 41 years of reading locks had taught me that a question shaped like that one, old client data, a duplicate key, men arriving in the dark with an empty folio and leaving with a full one, was not a question a father should try to answer alone. I called Marcus from my workshop with the door shut, voice pitched low, even though I was the only living soul in the house who wasn't upstairs drying her hair. Dad. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting. Are you all right? I saw them, Marcus. 3 men. Derek let them in. They used. My voice caught in a way it hadn't caught since Eleanor's funeral. They used your mother's key. The one from her grandmother's house. It was in a box on my nightstand 3 years. And last night a stranger turned it in my front door, like it was cut yesterday. A long silence on the line, long enough that I heard him exhale slowly, the way he used to, before delivering bad news as a beat cop. Dad. I need you to sit down if you're not already. I'm sitting. The Bureau's been building a case for 14 months on an organized burglary and identity theft ring working the west side and out toward the western suburbs. High-value elderly homeowners, mostly people with old money security setups, safes, specialty locks, the kind installed 20-30 years ago by a small handful of local locksmiths who are mostly retired or dead now. The ring doesn't break in. That's the whole signature of it. They walk in with a working key or a working code, take documents and small valuables, and they're gone before anyone even knows a burglary happened, sometimes for months. We've cleared 6 locksmith shops off our list of possible sources over the past year. We had 1 left we couldn't clear. He paused. Yours, Dad, because you closed up and the paper trail went quiet. I couldn't get a warrant on you. Not that I ever thought it was you, but I couldn't rule out someone with access to your records, and conflict of interest meant I couldn't run point on it myself. I've had a colleague working it from a distance for months. 2 nights ago, that colleague picked up chatter that a crew was moving on a residential target in Ohio City using a duplicated antique key. I didn't know the address until I put it together with something else I'd been sitting on for weeks and didn't want to believe. What? I said, though some cold, locksmith's part of my brain had already guessed. Derek's financials, Dad. He's not a wealth manager. Not really. He's a facilitator. He identifies vulnerable, asset-rich targets, often through marriage, through caretaking arrangements, sometimes just through research, gets close, gets access, and feeds information to a crew that specializes in exactly this kind of quiet entry. Your old client ledger would be worth an enormous amount of money to men like that. Addresses of people your age or older, with locks and safes installed decades ago that in a lot of cases were never upgraded. I think that's what those men left with last night. I sat in my work chair, surrounded by 31 restored locks that had never once failed to make sense to me, and for the first time in my adult life I felt like the world had handed me a mechanism I couldn't read. And Claire, I said, because I had to. I don't know how much she knows, Marcus said, gentler than I'd heard him in years. I hope, for your sake and hers, it's less than it looks like. But Dad, I need you to do something very hard. I need you to keep acting like nothing's wrong. Don't confront them. Don't call the police yourself. If Derek realizes we're circling him, he goes to ground, destroys whatever's left, and we lose the whole ring, not just him. Can you do that? I thought of 41 years standing behind a counter, waiting out customers who lied about how they'd lost a key, waiting to see if the story would hold or crack under its own weight. Patience had never once failed me. I can do that, I said. But Marcus, I want to know one more thing before I hang up, that petition. The one where they'd need me declared unfit. Silence. You knew about that, I said. I suspected, he admitted. It fits the pattern. Guardianship gives legal, uncontested access to everything, the house, the accounts, and eventually, if nobody's watching closely, whatever's left in that ledger of yours that a crew hasn't already used. I hung up the phone and sat very still for a long time, listening to the pipes finally go quiet. 2 floors above me as Claire finished her shower, and I understood that the woman who used to fall asleep on my workshop couch was either being used by a predator with expert precision, or she had walked into this with her eyes wide open. I did not know which possibility frightened me more. I found the draft petition 11 days later, the way you find most true things in this life. By accident in the trash, half buried under coffee grounds because the person who wrote it wasn't careful enough to burn it. Derek took the trash out every Friday morning himself. Always had, never let me touch it, which should have told me something the very first week and instead took me 3 years to notice. That particular Friday, I got up before dawn and went through the bin in the garage before he could wheel it to the curb. Petition for determination of incapacity and appointment of guardian. My name typed clean at the top. Harold J. Whitfield, age 63. Claims of memory lapses, confusion regarding financial matters, concerning behavior consistent with early cognitive decline, requested guardians, Claire Whitfield Voss and Derek Voss, full authority over finances, property, and medical decisions. I smoothed the coffee-stained page flat on my workbench under the desk lamp and read it 3 times, and each time the anger in my chest burned a little cleaner, a little more useful, the way heat tempers steel instead of just melting it. I did not confront them. I called a lawyer instead, a woman named Adeline Cho, elder rights specialist, recommended by the Historical Society director I still cut ceremonial keys for, a woman with a reputation, I was told, for taking apart guardianship fraud the way I used to take apart a jammed lock, methodically and without mercy for whoever had jammed it. Her office sat on the 9th floor of a building downtown with a view of the river bending brown and slow past the flats. She listened to my whole story without interrupting once, and when I finished, she set down her pen with the calm of a woman who had heard versions of this before and hated every one of them equally. Mr. Whitfield, you're in a genuinely dangerous situation, and you're also, and I want you to hear this clearly, remarkably lucky. You found the petition before it was filed. Most families I represent don't get that warning. What do? First, independent psychiatric evaluation from a doctor with no connection to your son-in-law or his associates. I know exactly the man for it. Second, we change every lock in your house today, and I understand. She allowed herself a small, dry smile. that you may be uniquely qualified to handle that part yourself. New safe combination if you have one. Third, we draft a new will, revoke any existing powers of attorney, set up a living trust that protects the house and your accounts from any guardianship claim before it's ever filed. Fourth, and this is the part that matters most, Mr. Whitfield, we need evidence, not suspicion. Evidence, in their own words, of the plan and the motive behind it. I thought of my 31 locks on their shelves, each one a small monument to patience, to taking something broken apart piece by piece until you understood exactly how it had failed. I can get you evidence, I said. Dr. Amos Feldman's office looked less like a clinic and more like a study. Leather chairs, walls of books, the kind of quiet that lets a mind actually think instead of just perform for a stranger. He put me through 2 hours of memory work, reasoning problems, questions about my daily habits and decisions, and when it was done, he leaned back and studied me the way I used to study a lock I couldn't quite place the manufacture date on. Mr. Whitfield, he said finally, there is nothing whatsoever wrong with your cognitive function. Your memory, frankly, is exceptional for a man of any age. If someone is building a case that you're incapacitated, they are either badly mistaken or they are lying. Based on what you've told me, I don't believe it's the former. He signed and dated the report right there and handed it across the desk, and I folded it into my jacket pocket like a man carrying the deed to his own mind back out into the world. The locks I changed myself on a Saturday when Derek and Claire drove out to look at office space, which I now understood meant something else entirely. Every deadbolt in the house, front, back, garage, workshop, replaced with a 5-pin high-security cylinder I'd been saving in a box in my basement for a customer who never came back to collect it years ago. New safe combination. I chose the date Eleanor, and I first opened the shop together, a number only I would ever hold in my head again. When I finished, I stood in my own front hallway and turned the new key in the new lock and felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight for 3 years. It was, for the first time since her funeral, entirely and only my house. The recording device Adeline's investigator provided was smaller than a shirt button, and I knew exactly where to hide it. Inside the hollowed brass body of a 19th century padlock I'd restored years ago, one of the 31 pieces on my workshop shelf, the kind of object nobody but a locksmith would ever think to open, because the mechanism looked entirely functional and entirely uninteresting to anyone who didn't know locks the way I did. I moved it to the living room mantel, told Claire it needed better light for a photograph I was taking for the Historical Society's newsletter, and she never once questioned why her father was suddenly fussing over an old padlock's display angle. It took 11 days of patience before the padlock caught what I needed. I'd nearly given up hope some evenings, listening to nothing but television and small talk, when I checked the recordings at night in my workshop with headphones on, so no sound would carry. And then, on a Tuesday, while I sat in the next room with a newspaper I wasn't reading, I heard Derek's voice through my earbuds 2 hours later, low, satisfied, talking to Claire on the couch he thought was private. Feldman's report's a problem, but Morrison can still write a competing eval if we push the filing date back a few weeks. Once we're guardians, the house sells, the accounts liquidate, and that ledger of his, Turner's crew, is already 3 properties deep off the client list. That's 40-50 grand just sitting on a shelf that old man doesn't even know is worth anything. And Claire, quiet, and then, he trusts you completely, you know? It's kind of sad. It's useful, Derek said, and I heard him laugh, actually laugh, the sound of it landing in my chest like a dropped tool. I listened to that recording 5 times that night, alone in my workshop among 31 locks that had never once lied to me, and by the 5th time my hands had stopped shaking and settled instead into something colder and steadier. They believed the old man in the recliner with the newspaper was exactly what he appeared to be. They had no idea he'd spent his whole life learning to see through exactly that kind of disguise, because he'd built a career on knowing the difference between a lock that looked secure and a lock that actually was. I brought the recording to Adeline the next morning. She played it once, jaw tightening with every sentence, and when it ended she looked at me with something between admiration and genuine anger on my behalf. Mr. Whitfield, she said, this is no longer just a guardianship fraud case. This is financial exploitation, conspiracy, and very likely felony evidence relevant to a federal burglary investigation your own son is running. I want to file everything we've prepared, new will, trust, injunction on your accounts, quietly, before they know it's coming. And then, when you're ready, I think it's time to let them find out exactly how wrong they were about you. I've been ready, I told her, since the night I watched a stranger turn my dead wife's key in my own front door. 3 weeks after that, too. 13 a.m. text, everything was in place. My accounts required in-person authorization for any transaction. My new will was filed, my trust established, my psychiatric evaluation sealed and notarized. Marcus told me, in a call I'll remember the exact words of for the rest of my life, that the Bureau was less than 2 weeks from moving on the entire crew, Derek Voss included, and that once they moved, it would be loud and public, and there would be no taking it back. Are you ready for that, Dad? I looked across my kitchen at the cedar box, empty now on my dresser upstairs, at the space where Eleanor's key used to sit every single night for 3 years, like a small piece of proof that love outlasts fire. I've been ready my whole life, I said. I just didn't know it until somebody used the wrong key on the wrong door. The morning I decided to end it, I woke before dawn the way I always did now. Old habits from the shop returning stronger than they'd been in years. I lay in bed a few minutes longer than usual, looking at the empty cedar box on the dresser, and I made a decision I'd been circling for days. I found Claire alone in the kitchen. Derek already gone to whatever he called his morning meetings now. She was stirring coffee she didn't need sugar in, same as always. Same nervous habit she'd had since she was a teenager, working up the nerve to ask permission for something she already suspected I'd refuse. I know about the petition, I said, no preamble, because I'd used up all my patience for preamble 3 weeks in a basement window. I found the draft in the trash. I know about Morrison, the Dr. Derek, lined up to sign off on it. And I know about the men who came to this house at 4 a.m. with your mother's key. The color drained out of her face so fast I thought she might need to sit down. Dad, I can. Don't, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I'm not the confused old man you and Derek have been managing for 3 years. I want you both gone by the time I get home this afternoon. I'm meeting my lawyer. Your lawyer, she repeated, like the words didn't make sense arranged in that order. Adeline Cho. Elder rights. You should remember that name, because you're about to hear it a great deal. I left her standing at the counter, coffee going cold in her hands, and I spent the rest of that day finalizing everything with Adeline that we'd spent 3 weeks quietly building. Eviction notice, 30 days as Ohio law required, civil complaint for financial exploitation and emotional distress, and sitting in a manila folder on Adeline's desk like the calm center of a storm, everything Marcus's people needed to move. They moved that Thursday, at dawn, the way I imagine most quiet, dangerous things finally end. Not with sirens, but with a knock on a motel door and men in windbreakers standing very still until it opened. Marcus called me that afternoon from the federal building downtown. Derek's in custody, he said. So are 2 of the 3 men from that night. Ray Turner and a man going by Sal Kovac, though that's not his real name. Bail's set high enough neither of them's walking before trial. Dad, we found your mother's key in Derek's car. Chain of custody's solid. It's evidence now, but you'll get it back eventually. I sat in my workshop with the phone against my ear and looked at the space on the wall where the empty cedar box's contents should have been, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel at that particular news. Not triumph, not yet. Just a long, slow exhale, like a lock finally releasing after years of being forced the wrong direction. And Claire? A pause I'd come to recognize as Marcus choosing his words as carefully as a man diffusing something. The guardianship scheme is civil, not criminal, unless we can show she had direct knowledge of the burglary ring specifically, not just the incapacity petition. Right now, what we have puts that knowledge mostly on Derek. She's not facing federal charges. Not yet, anyway. Not yet was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and both of us knew it. The guardianship hearing came 2 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning in a courtroom that smelled like old paper and nervous sweat. the way I imagine every courtroom in the country smells on a morning like that. Adeline sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, sharp and unhurried in a charcoal suit. Across the aisle, Claire sat with a public defender who looked barely older than my grandson would be someday. Derek's chair beside her conspicuously empty. Since federal custody doesn't grant furlough for a civil guardianship, hearing your husband's own scheme created, Judge Renata Ibarra read the petition into the record in a flat, professional voice that gave away nothing. Claire's lawyer called two witnesses, a neighbor who claimed I'd been confused about the date of a block party, and a former customer of mine who said I'd repeated a story about a lock repair twice in one visit. Small, unprovable, exactly the kind of manufactured fog Derek had clearly been building for months before the petition was ever drafted. Then Adeline stood, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop the way it does right before a real storm breaks. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an independent psychiatric evaluation dated 3 weeks ago. She handed it to the bailiff, and I'd like to play a recording. Derek's voice filled that courtroom, tinny through the small speaker but unmistakable, laughing about a ledger worth $50,000 sitting on a shelf. An old man didn't know was valuable. Claire's voice beside his agreeing that her father trusted him completely, that it was kind of sad. I watched the color leave my daughter's face for the second time that month, and this time there was nowhere for her to set down a coffee cup to steady her hands. Objection. The public defender started, weak even to his own ears by the sound of it. Recording consent. Ohio is a one-party consent state, Your Honor, Adeline said, calm as still water. Mr. Whitfield was a party to every conversation recorded in his own home. This evidence is entirely admissible. Judge Ibarra's expression, which had given away nothing for 20 minutes, gave away everything in that instant. A kind of controlled, professional disgust I imagine she'd trained herself to keep off her face and mostly succeeded, except for the tightening at the corner of her mouth. I have one more witness, Adeline said, and the courtroom doors opened, and Marcus walked in wearing a suit instead of a windbreaker, credentials in hand, and took the stand. Special Agent Marcus Whitfield, he said, after being sworn, Financial Crimes Division. Chester, my father, Harold Whitfield, was targeted by an organized burglary and identity theft crew operating across Cuyahoga County for at least 14 months. Derek Voss, the co-petitioner in this guardianship request, is currently in federal custody, charged with conspiracy, grand theft, and facilitating burglary through insider access to my father's 40-year client records as a licensed locksmith. On the night of, he checked his notes, though I don't believe he needed them, September the 23rd, this crew entered my father's home using a duplicate key made from a personal family heirloom, taken from inside that residence without my father's knowledge or consent. The room went so quiet I could hear the courthouse's old radiator ticking somewhere behind the bench. This guardianship petition, Marcus continued, appears to be part of a coordinated effort to gain uncontested legal control of my father's assets and property, while a separate criminal enterprise simultaneously stripped that property of decades of confidential locksmith records for use in additional burglaries. Judge Ibarra set down her pen. Mrs. Whitfield Voss, she said to Claire, whose eyes were wet and fixed somewhere in the middle distance, do you have anything you wish to say before I rule? I watched my daughter open her mouth and close it and finally shake her head, no. This petition is denied, the judge said. I am ordering a copy of today's transcript sent to the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office. Mrs. Whitfield Voss, I strongly suggest you retain independent counsel of your own, separate from your husband's, and consider carefully what that counsel advises you about your legal exposure going forward. The gavel came down, and just like that, 3 years of managed, monitored, carefully diminished days ended in a sound no louder than a knock on a door. Adeline shook my hand outside the courtroom, and Marcus pulled me into a hug I felt in my whole chest. And I stood on the courthouse steps in the thin autumn sunlight and understood that the legal battle, the loud, public part of it, was over. What came after was quieter, and in its way harder. Claire showed up at my house 4 days later. I saw her through the front window before she reached the porch, and for the first time in 3 years, I noticed how small she'd gotten, how the confident, well-dressed woman who'd married Derek Voss at a vineyard 2 years back had thinned into someone who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. I almost didn't open the door. I stood in my own front hallway, key in hand, my key, my new lock, my house entirely, and made myself turn it. "Dad," she said, voice cracking on the single syllable, "can we talk?" We sat in the living room, her on the couch, me in Eleanor's old chair, the mantel between us where the padlock still sat, though I'd removed the recording device from it days earlier. She looked at it for a long moment before she spoke again, and I wondered if she knew, or guessed, what it had held. "I didn't know about the burglaries," she said. "I swear to you, Dad, I didn't know what Derek was doing with your ledger, with those men. I let myself believe the guardianship was just paperwork, just protecting the house and the family. He made it sound reasonable. He always made everything sound reasonable. And the key," I said. Just that. 2 words, and I watched them land on her like a physical blow. Her face crumpled. "I gave it to him," she said, barely a whisper. 8 months ago. He said, if anything happened to you suddenly, we'd need something that proved family access to the house, something a court couldn't question, and it was just sitting in a box. Dad, it wasn't even functional. I didn't think. "It was your mother," I said, and my voice did something I hadn't let it do in front of my daughter since the week Eleanor died. "It wasn't a spare key, Claire. It was the only thing that survived a fire that happened before your mother was even born. She kept it because it proved something could outlast the flames that tried to take it. And you handed it to a man who used it to walk strangers into this house in the middle of the night." She was crying now, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than embarrassment, somewhere closer to grief. "I know. I know what I did. I've been in therapy 3 times a week since Derek's arrest. My lawyer, my own lawyer, not his, says I need to actually sit with what I did instead of explaining it away. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't expect you to. I just needed you to know I understand now what that key meant, what I did with it." I sat with that for a long moment, listening to the old grandfather clock in the hallway, the one I'd restored the year Marcus was born, tick through the silence between us. "Sorry doesn't put it back in the box, Jessica," I said. "No, forgive me. I mean, Claire, my mind still catches sometimes even now, thinking of every daughter and every story I've ever told myself about betrayal and love tangled together until you can't cut one free of the other without wounding both. It doesn't undo the year I spent being managed in my own house. It doesn't erase men walking through my front door with your mother's memory in their hands." "I know," she said again. "I'm filing for divorce. My lawyer says it separates me from his restitution debt, at least partly. I don't know if that matters to you." "It matters to your future," I said. "Whether it matters to us, that's something I can't answer today. Is there anything I can do? Anything at all?" I thought about it longer than I expected to. "Get a job that's entirely yours. Not something Derek arranged, not something that runs through anyone's approval but your own. Pay whatever the civil judgment ends up being, every dollar, on time. Prove to yourself, not to me, that you can be trusted with something small before you ever ask to be trusted with something large again. Maybe in a few years when you've done that, we talk. Not today." She nodded, wiped her face, and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back one more time, the way people in these moments always seem to. "I do still love you, Dad." "I know," I said, and I meant it, and it wasn't enough, and both of those things were true at the same time. The way a lock can be beautifully made and still fail the one time it matters most. Love isn't the part I doubt, Claire. Judgment is. She left. I locked the door behind her, my lock, my key, no one else's, and I went down to my workshop and sat for a long time among 31 restored locks that had never once, in all my years of working on them, betrayed me the way people sometimes do. Derek's plea came 6 weeks later. 15 years federal, restitution to 11 identified victims across 3 counties, mine among them. The ledger money never fully recoverable, but the theory of the crime laid bare in open court for anyone who cared to read the transcript. Ray Turner and the man calling himself Sal Kovac took separate deals, shorter sentences, cooperation in exchange for names further up a chain that stretched, Marcus told me, into 2 additional states. The civil suit resolved without a trial. Claire didn't contest it. Adeline told me afterward that was rare, that most defendants fight to the last dollar even when they know they'll lose, and that Claire's choice not to fight was, in her professional opinion, the first entirely honest thing my daughter had done since this whole ordeal began. The judgment came to $68,000, structured into payments she could actually make over 10 years, without it destroying whatever life she managed to rebuild. I didn't ask for more. I didn't need to prove anything further to a courtroom. I'd already proven it to myself, alone in a basement window 3 years too late and exactly in time. I sold the house on Bridge Avenue that winter. Too many locks in that house had learned the wrong lessons about who could be trusted with a key. A young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever bought it, full of plans for the garden Eleanor used to keep, and I shook the husband's hand at closing and told him the workshop wiring was solid and the deadbolts were only months old, top quality install date and everything logged if he ever needed the specs. I moved into a smaller place near the lake. Second bedroom converted into a workshop half the size of the old one, but plenty for a man my age, and 31 restored locks that fit easily on 2 shelves instead of 4. Sal Ricci, my old apprentice, comes by most Sundays now, the way he used to before Derek ever answered a single one of my phone calls for me. I started teaching a free class at the community center on Tuesday evenings, basic home security, how to spot a lock that's been tampered with, mostly for retirees living alone, men and women who remind me, more than I like to admit, of exactly who I was 3 years ago, without knowing it. Marcus visits with his wife and their 2 kids most weekends. My grandson, Theo, 6 years old, sits on the workshop floor now the way his aunt once did, handing me screws, asking why brass tarnishes and steel doesn't. And I answer him with the same patience I gave Claire once, and I try very hard not to let the echo of that hurt the moment more than it deserves to. Claire sends a postcard every few weeks. No return address, but I know her handwriting the way I know a familiar lock by feel. Got a job at a bookstore downtown, entirely on my own. Made this month's payment early. Therapist says I'm finally starting to understand why I stopped seeing you clearly. Miss you, Dad. I keep them in a small cedar box on my new dresser, not the same box, a different one I bought myself, because some things you don't put back where a stranger's hands once reached. I haven't answered a single postcard yet. I'm not sure when I will, or if I will, or what it will feel like when I do, but I keep them, which tells me something about where I stand even when I can't say it out loud. Last week, Theo asked me, sitting cross-legged on my workshop floor with a practice lock and a bent paperclip in his small hands, why some locks are easy to open and some are hard. Depends what they're protecting, buddy, I told him. The things that matter most usually take the most patience to get into. And sometimes, I added, mostly to myself, the ones that matter most can't really be locked at all. You just have to trust the right person to be careful with them. He thought about that with the seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage, turning the paperclip slowly in the practice cylinder the way I'd shown him. Grandpa, he said, every lock has a key somewhere, but not every heart does. I don't know where a boy that age picks up a sentence like that, whether he half remembered it from a show or simply felt his way into it the way I used to feel my way into a stuck tumbler, but I sat very still on that workshop floor for a long moment, surrounded by 31 restored locks that had never once lied to me, and I thought that if I lived to be 100, I don't believe I'll ever hear a truer thing said in this house. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.